ways of looking at music theory, and something I've always found interesting is there's no one particular approach that pins the subject down totally. In this lesson, I want to introduce you to a system that I've sort of evolved over a number of years, really, that links together many of the major elements in music with their corresponding relative minor elements. Now, I'm going to use the term elements quite a bit in this lesson. By musical element, I simply mean a note, a chord, a scale, or an arpeggio. The process of working through this lesson will highlight a number of interesting connections that I'm hoping will help you consolidate your grasp of the subject matter that we've covered thus far on the Guitar Music Theory course. Now, to make best sense of this lesson, it's probably best if at the outset you print out the accompanying diagram. Because as you can see, the whole thing is really too big to show on the screen. Let's start by focusing on the top line of the diagram. As usual, we're taking the key of C major as our example key. I'm sure that by now you will appreciate how you could apply these ideas to any key. So in the block top left, coloured light red, we have the scale of C major written out with each degree of the scale numbered. This is going to provide a reference for each line as we work downwards. On the first of the green coloured lines, we start with the simplest musical element of all, the single note. In this case, we have the note C because we're thinking in the key of C major. Told you it was simple. The next simplest element I can think of is the octave. So now, as well as a C at number 1 position, I have another C at position 8 in the scale. Then we move down another line and add something else. The next simplest element I can think of is what we normally call the power chord, or the 5th chord. Which in its rudimentary form is just made up of the 1st and 5th note of the scale. So there's a C 5th chord, it's got the note C from the major scale, G and another C at the top. So it's the octave plus the 5th note of the scale, and that's the C5 or C power chord. This is usually marked on a rhythm chart as a C5, and you can see this in the symbol column on the chart. There isn't really a symbol for a C octave. You would have to rely on tab or notation to show it. On the chart, I have used the superscript 1, the little figure 1 just to the right of the letter C, but really this is used specifically to denote C 1 octave above middle C. Under the column far right, marked tonality, I've noted that these first 3 elements all have dual tonality. That means that they can equally well be used against a major element as they can against a minor one. Moving down the chart, the next element I wanted to include is the added 6th. As with many aspects of music theory, opinion differs as to how to name this element. Now there are many sources, particularly those based on classical training, that call this an added sixth chord. Now that's a C chord, but with the sixth note, the A, added to it, which is fair enough, calling it an added sixth, but I prefer to call that a C sixth or a C major sixth, and I think you'll find that that's the most common name for that chord. For me, the C added sixth means the fifth chord, the power chord, with the sixth note added, as used to make the sort of basic underlying rhythm pattern of so many blues, R&B, or rock and roll songs. You can see that I have assigned this a tonality of mostly major. Now this is based on how I observe this being used in the real world of musical performance. So generally speaking, if you're playing in a band as a second guitarist and the other guitarist is playing the added sixth shuffle, you'd probably play major chords against it. Hear that if we play minor instead, doesn't exactly sound wrong, it just sounds different to what we're used to. Likewise, if we were playing with a bass, and the bass was, normally the bass would be playing something like 1, 3, 5, 6, that sort of riff. Against our you can hear that blends very nicely, but again there's no reason why the bass shouldn't be playing the minor third. Something like that. Probably more like that. You can hear that that matches perfectly well, it's just not quite what we're used to hearing. So that's why I describe the tonality as mostly major. Now we move into the red section of the chart, where the tonality of each element is most definitely major. And this is simply because the third note is now added into the mix. So our next element is the major triad, which by now I am confident you will be familiar with as notes 1, 3 and 5 from the major scale. Next is the major sixth chord, and as explained earlier, this is distinguished from the added sixth by including the third, and because of this, again, can only be used with major tonality. The major sixth chord is a straight substitute really for a major chord, and it's often used in endings, either to impart a sort of country flavour, something like this, or a more sort of jazz-like ending. Nice sort of soft sounding chord. Now I want to pause at this stage and just say that we could have included the major seventh and dominant seventh chords in this diagram at this stage. The only reason for not doing so is that had I included those two chord types, the whole diagram would have suddenly got far more complex than it already is, to accommodate all the extra musical elements that are built on those two particular chord types. So I sort of selected the major sixth as a representative of 4-note chords that evolve out of the major triad. And we'll go forward and see what happens when we build on that. As our 5-note chord, I've selected the major sixth 9. We've already mentioned this chord in the context of the lesson on pentatonic theory. It's a lovely, soft jazz chord. And again, it's very often used as a substitute for the major, especially in endings, to sort of really smooth out the landing. Its formula is 1, 3, 5, 6, 9. And this is our first glimpse of chords that nominally extend beyond 1 octave. So the 9th note is the same as the 2nd note of the scale, but you're encouraged to select a voicing with this note coming from the higher octave. Strictly speaking, this doesn't affect the harmonic quality of the chord because the laws of harmony apply irrespective of pitch. But it does make the chord sound a lot less muddy. We could have put the D note in the lower octave. We could have it here on the open D string. And then we could put our 6th note there. We'll put the octave back there. And we'll have our 5th up here. So with that voicing, that's the same notes. We can hear that sounds a little bit muddy compared to this voicing where we put the D in the top octave here. Just sounds a whole lot sweeter. So that's why we call it a 9th and not a 2nd. Now we come to an interesting dividing line. Thus far, all the elements we've described can be played as chords. That means that we can play them all their notes simultaneously. But now we're reaching a point where things are just getting too crowded. So from here, we stop calling these elements chords and instead refer to them as scales. So you can see that our next element is the major pentatonic scale. And as we've already mentioned in the pentatonic theory lessons, this scale contains the very same notes as the major 6th, 9th chord. The only difference is that in the formula we refer to the 9th note simply as the 2nd, the note D in this case. As also explored in the pentatonic theory lesson, we can add just one note to the major pentatonic scale to get the country scale. So here's our major pentatonic. If we add in the flat 3rd note, which is here, we get our country scale. Now, if you look down the formula column, you'll see that this is the only element in the major section that has accidentals or non-diatonic notes in it. As such, it almost doesn't really belong in this chart, but I have included it for a reason that will become apparent a little later down the chart. And in the last line of the red section, the section labelled as firmly major in tonality, we arrive at the major scale itself, which we know we can get to by adding the 4th and 7th notes to the pentatonic. Then, smack in the middle of the diagram, I've put the chromatic scale, which I describe as neutral in tonality. When using the chromatic scale for songwriting or improvising, the tonality of your phrasing can be asserted by accentuating notes from musical elements that do have well-defined tonality. For example, if we take the C major sixth arpeggio, so we've got the major sixth 1, 3, 5, 6, 8. We've got to link those notes chromatically. But still accentuating the notes of the major sixth arpeggio, then I'd be improvising in a way that would work over a major element in the backing. Similarly, if I took a minor element, we'll say the C minor pentatonic scale, I could link those notes chromatically, and that would work over a minor element. Cases, it's the accentuation, the rhythmic accentuation of the notes that determines the tonality when you're working chromatically. So, having worked through the top half of the diagram, which focuses mainly on elements that have major tonality, we now move on to the relative minor key. Now, you'll remember from previous lessons that the way we do this is simply by taking the sixth note of the major scale. In this case, as we're working with C major, we take the note A. And we simply build a scale starting on that note, using all the same notes as the relative major, in this case the C scale. So here you can see the result, the A natural minor scale being simply a rearrangement of the notes from the C major scale. But notice that in order to determine the formula for this scale, we relate it to its parallel major scale, in this case A major, here shown at the bottom of the diagram. Notice also that the scale is defined simply by the 3 degrees that differ from this reference scale: the flatted third, the flatted sixth and flatted seventh. The scale on the next line down is the blues scale. This contains exactly the same notes as its major counterpart, the C country scale. But of course its formula is very different. Again, referencing it to the A major scale, we have the formula 1 flat 3, 4 flat 5, 5 flat 7, which we've already explored to some extent in the lesson on pentatonic theory. Stripping the flatted fifth out of this scale pares it down to the minor pentatonic scale, which shares its notes with the major pentatonic in the relative key. Then, again as previously discussed on the pentatonic theory lessons, with a slight rejiggling of the notes, we cross the divide from scale to chord by taking the fourth from the minor pentatonic and kicking it up an octave. It becomes an 11th, and we get the chord A minor 7 11th. Remember, that's the chord that I described as being the easiest chord to play in standard tuning. That's the A minor 7 11th chord. That's the E minor 7th 11th chord. They don't come any easier than that. Now notice too that this chord, the A minor 7th 11th, contains exactly the same notes as its major counterpart, the C major 6 9th. So here we've got the note A, D, G, C and E. Another A at the top. So that's A, D, G, C, E. And in this shape you can find the A there, the D there, G there, the C there and the E there. So again, whoops, different sounds, simply because the root note makes that sound minor and this one sound major. When two chords contain the same notes like that, but have completely different names, we sometimes refer to them as chord synonyms. On the next line, we strip away the 11th note and we are left with the A minor 7th chord, which is an exact chord synonym for the major 6th chord in the relative key. So there's A minor 7th and its major counterpart C major 6th. So again you can hear the tonality shift as I go from the A root note to the C root note. So one of the things that's special about this particular view of music theory is that it highlights how many major elements there are that have exact counterparts in the relative minor key. 5 such elements are shown on this chart, but note that once we get to the basic triad, the counterparts phenomenon disappears. The minor triad is the last element that I have attributed minor tonality to, but on the next line I have included an element called the added 7th. This has the formula 1-5 flat 7 and to my mind should work over minor chords similarly to the way the added 6th shuffle works over major chords. So this looks like this. We've got a C, we're going to add the note B flat and the note, we're going to add the note G, the open G, and then we're going to change that to the B flat. So that's C plus its 5th and then adding the flat 7th there. So I'm just going to kind of pinch this, the 5th and the 3rd string, like that. And you can hear that sort of fits over a minor chord quite nicely, a C minor there. Now, I'll be honest, this is not an idea in my experience that's used over much, but there's no reason at all why it shouldn't work in theory. And I rather like the idea that just as with the, as in the field of chemistry, the periodic table of elements help predict hitherto undiscovered chemical elements, so maybe our table of musical elements can help uncover musical ideas for composition that might hitherto have been overlooked. Then finally back into the green lines, we mirror the 3 elements from the top of the chart with the 5th chord, the octave and single note, all having dual tonality. Well, that's about that for our journey through this particular chart. But I'd always encourage you to develop your own ways of organising musical elements. There must be hundreds of possibilities, and I believe there's always something to be gained by looking at the wonderfully intricate world of music from different fresh perspectives. Okay, well, the remaining lessons on this course are a direct assault on the summit of the guitar music theory pyramid. And the next lesson we're going to take a look at the basis of all jazz harmonies, the diatonic series of 7th chords. So I look forward to seeing you in that lesson.